What happens when humanity's greatest weakness becomes their most powerful weapon? When a species known for starting wars over coffee preferences accidentally becomes the galaxy's most feared negotiators? When a simple human gesture of kindness breaks a 1,000-year-old interstellar conflict? Captain Jake Morrison thought he was just being polite when he offered his jacket to a shivering alien diplomat during peace talks. He had no idea that this small act would spark the most dangerous romance in galactic history, challenge the very foundations of an ancient empire, and force humanity to prove that sometimes the strongest warriors are those who choose love over conquest. This is the story of how one human's inability to let someone suffer in silence changed the fate of 3 star systems, toppled an empire built on fear, and proved that humanity's true superpower isn't our technology or our tactics, it's our stubborn refusal to let others face their battles alone. The conference room aboard the neutral station Haven's Rest felt more like a tomb than a place where the fate of 3 star systems would be decided. Captain Jake Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair, watching the delicate dance of diplomacy unfold before him. The air recyclers hummed with mechanical precision, but they couldn't filter out the tension that seemed to thicken with each passing hour. Jake wasn't supposed to be here. He was a cargo hauler, not a diplomat. His ship, the Wandering Star, was designed to carry supplies to frontier colonies, not ferry Earth's representatives to high-stakes peace negotiations. But, when the original transport had suffered a catastrophic engine failure 3 days out from Earth, someone in the diplomatic corps had looked at shipping manifests and decided that Captain Morrison's spotless safety record made him the best available option. Now he sat at the back of the room, trying to blend into the pristine white walls while representatives from Earth, the Kethrati Empire, and the Zephyrian Collective argued over territorial boundaries that had been in dispute for nearly 2 decades. The translator devices built into the table rendered every word in perfect English, but Jake found himself wishing they could also translate the subtle body language and cultural cues that seemed to carry just as much meaning as the actual words. Ambassador Chen from Earth leaned forward, her silver hair catching the soft blue lighting of the conference room. The mining rights to the Tau Cygni system were established by prior claim, she said, her voice carrying the practiced calm of someone who had spent decades negotiating with beings who could snap her in half without effort. Human colonies were established there in 2387, well before any other species showed interest in the system. Across from her, War Commander Vexthal of the Kethrati Empire rose to his full height of nearly 3 meters. His chitinous exoskeleton gleamed like polished obsidian, and the 4 mandibles around his mouth clicked in what Jake had learned was the Kethrati equivalent of a dismissive snort. Prior claim means nothing when established through violence, he rumbled, his voice like grinding stone even through the translator. Your species destroys everything it touches. The Tau Cygni worlds were pristine before your arrival. The third party in this delicate negotiation stirred for the first time in nearly an hour. Princess Kylara of the Zephyrian Collective had remained silent throughout most of the proceedings, her pale blue skin almost luminescent in the artificial lighting. Unlike the other Zephyrians Jake had encountered during his years of cargo runs to the Outer Rim, she wore simple robes of deep purple rather than the elaborate ceremonial armor he'd expected from someone of her rank. Perhaps, she said softly, her melodious voice cutting through the rising tension like a blade through silk, we should focus not on who arrived first, but on who can best preserve what remains. Her words carried the musical quality that marked all Zephyrian speech, but there was something else there too. A weariness that seemed to weigh down each syllable. Jake found himself leaning forward slightly, drawn by something indefinable in her tone. War Commander Vexthal's mandibles clicked more rapidly. The Collective speaks of preservation while harboring the very humans who poison 3 worlds in the Kepler system. Your neutrality is a convenient fiction, Princess. Jake watched as Princess Kylara's shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly. Her people's reputation for emotional control was legendary, but he'd spent enough time reading people across loading docks and trading posts to recognize stress when he saw it. She was fighting to maintain her composure, and it was costing her. Ambassador Chen jumped into the breach. The Kepler incident was an accident, as the investigation clearly showed. The terraforming bacteria was meant to accelerate plant growth, not to consume all organic matter on 3 continents, Vexthal finished, his forearms spreading wide in a gesture that Jake assumed was the Kethrati version of throwing up one's hands in frustration. Your accidents have a curious tendency to benefit human expansion, Ambassador. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Jake glanced at the environmental controls and frowned. The system showed normal parameters, but Princess Kylara had wrapped her arms around herself as if fighting off a chill. Her people were adapted to warmer climates than humans preferred, he remembered from his cultural briefings. The diplomatic protocol probably called for a compromise temperature that left everyone slightly uncomfortable. The arguing continued for another hour, voices rising and falling like the tide. Jake found himself watching Princess Kylara more than the other negotiators. There was something compelling about the way she held herself perfectly straight despite her obvious discomfort, listening intently to every word even when the discussion devolved into barely civilized accusations. She reminded him of the statue of justice outside the courthouse back on Earth, blindfolded and steadfast, but somehow more fragile. When Ambassador Chen called for a recess, Jake was already shrugging out of his jacket. It was an old leather flight jacket his father had given him when he'd first gotten his pilot's license, worn soft by years of use and countless trips through decontamination cycles. Without thinking, he approached the Zephyrian princess as she remained seated while the others filed out. "Excuse me, Your Highness," he said quietly, extending the jacket toward her. "You look cold." The effect of his words was immediate and electric. Every person still in the room froze as if someone had activated a stasis field. Ambassador Chen's mouth fell open. War Commander Vexthal's mandibles went completely still for the first time since Jake had met him. The two Zephyrian guards flanking their princess moved their hands to their weapons with fluid grace. Princess Kylara stared up at Jake with eyes the color of deep ocean water. For a moment that stretched into eternity, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Jake began to suspect he had somehow committed a terrible diplomatic blunder, but he wasn't sure what else he could have done. Letting someone sit there shivering just felt wrong. Then, Princess Kylara smiled. It started small, just a slight upturn at the corners of her mouth. But it grew, transforming her entire face from the mask of diplomatic reserve she'd worn all day into something warm and genuine and entirely unexpected. She reached out with hands that trembled slightly, from cold or something else, Jake couldn't tell, and accepted his jacket. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "No one has offered me comfort in many years." She slipped her arms into the sleeves, and the jacket that had fit Jake's broad shoulders perfectly engulfed her smaller frame. She pulled it close around herself, and, for just a moment, her diplomatic composure cracked completely. She looked not like a princess negotiating the fate of star systems, but like someone who had been carrying a tremendous burden for far too long. War Commander Vexthal was the first to break the spell. "Human," he said, and there was something different in his tone, not the grinding hostility from before, but a kind of puzzled consideration. "What are your intentions toward the princess?" Jake blinked, confused by the question. "I don't have any intentions." She was cold. "I had a jacket." It seemed like the decent thing to do. The Kethrati warrior's mandibles began clicking again, but slower now, more thoughtfully. "The decent thing," he repeated, as if testing the translation software's interpretation of Jake's words. Ambassador Chen had recovered her composure first, as befitted someone with decades of diplomatic experience. "Captain Morrison," she said carefully, "perhaps you should return to your ship. I'm sure you have maintenance duties to attend to." It was a polite dismissal, but Jake didn't move. Something about the way Princess Kylara held his jacket, like it was a lifeline rather than a simple piece of clothing, made him reluctant to leave. "If it's all the same to you, Ambassador, I'd like to stay for the next session. I'm curious about how this turns out." "That may not be wise," Chen said, shooting a meaningful glance toward the Zephyrian guards. But Princess Kylara spoke up before anyone could object further. "I would be honored by Captain Morrison's continued presence," she said formally. "His perspective may prove valuable to our discussions." War Commander Vexthal made a sound that might have been laughter if it had come from a human throat. "The princess wishes to keep her new protector close." "How fascinating." "I'm not her protector," Jake said quickly. "I'm just a cargo hauler who doesn't like seeing people uncomfortable." "Just a cargo hauler," Princess Kylara repeated softly, still wearing his jacket like armor. How refreshing. The next session began an hour later, and Jake noticed immediately that something had shifted in the room's dynamics. Ambassador Chen seemed more cautious in her statements, frequently glancing toward Jake as if seeking his approval for her negotiating positions. War Commander Vexthal had abandoned his previous aggressive posturing, instead watching Jake with the calculating attention of a predator studying an unexpected variable. But the biggest change was in Princess Kylara herself. She still chose her words carefully, still maintained the diplomatic protocols that had kept the collective neutral in human Cathrati conflicts for 2 decades. But she seemed somehow more present, more engaged. When she spoke, she looked directly at the person she was addressing rather than staring at some point in the middle distance. The Zephyrian Collective has no desire to see the Tau Cygni system become another battlefield, she said during a particularly heated exchange about mining quotas. We have seen too much of what war costs all of our peoples. War Commander Vexthal leaned forward, his black eyes glittering. And yet the Collective has allowed human ships to refuel at Zephyrian stations throughout this conflict. Your neutrality has been notably selective, Princess. We provide fuel and supplies to all travelers who approach in peace, she replied evenly. That includes Cathrati vessels, when they choose to request aid rather than demand tribute. It was a pointed reminder of the different approaches the two species took to diplomacy, and Vexthal's mandibles clicked in what Jake was beginning to recognize as grudging respect. The Collective speaks of neutrality, the War Commander said slowly, but harbors those who show kindness to its leaders. Tell me, Princess, what would you call a human who offers comfort without expectation of reward? Jake felt the weight of every eye in the room settling on him again. Princess Kylara's fingers tightened on the edges of his jacket, and, when she spoke, her voice carried a quality he hadn't heard from her before, something deeper than diplomatic courtesy, more personal than political calculation. I would call such a human unexpected, she said. The way she said the word made it sound like the highest possible compliment. Jake found himself wondering what kind of life Princess Kylara had led that simple kindness could surprise her so completely. The thought bothered him more than he cared to admit. As the day's negotiations drew to a close, Ambassador Chen approached him with the expression of someone about to deliver bad news. Captain Morrison, I need to speak with you privately. They stepped into a small observation lounge overlooking the station's central hub. Through the transparent aluminum windows, Jake could see ships from a dozen different species docked at the massive structure's outer rings. The sight always reminded him why he'd fallen in love with space travel in the first place, the infinite possibility of worlds and peoples beyond imagination. Jake, Ambassador Chen said, dropping the formal titles they'd maintained in front of the other delegations, I need you to understand what happened in there today. I offered someone my jacket, he said simply. I'm not sure what needs explaining. Chen sighed, suddenly, looking older than her 70 years. In Zephyrian culture, offering personal items to someone of higher social rank is either a grave insult or something else entirely. Something else? A courtship gesture, she said bluntly. You essentially asked Princess Kylara to consider a romantic relationship with you. In front of witnesses. At a diplomatic conference where her people's neutrality hangs in the balance. Jake felt his stomach drop toward his boots. I was just trying to be helpful. I know that. You know that. But cultural context matters in these situations, Jake. The Cathrati delegation is already speculating about human influence over Zephyrian policy. If they believe the princess has been compromised by emotional attachment to a human, it could destabilize the entire negotiation. Through the observation window, Jake watched a sleek Zephyrian courier ship detach from the station and accelerate toward the jump point. So what happens now? Now you need to be very careful about how you interact with Princess Kylara for the remainder of these talks. Any sign that she's developed personal feelings could be interpreted as evidence of human manipulation. Jake thought about the way the princess had smiled when she'd accepted his jacket, the relief that had flooded her features when she'd pulled it around herself. And if she has developed personal feelings? Ambassador Chen was quiet for a long moment. Then, we're all in a lot more trouble than anyone anticipated. As they walked back toward the diplomatic quarters, Jake found himself thinking about Princess Kylara's words. Unexpected. He'd spent his entire adult life trying to be predictable, reliable, the kind of person others could count on to deliver cargo on time and without drama. But, apparently, in trying to be decent, he'd become something more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. The question was whether that was necessarily a bad thing. In her private quarters aboard the station, Princess Kylara sat at her meditation alcove, still wearing Jake Morrison's jacket despite having access to perfectly adequate climate controls. The leather smelled of machinery and recycled air and something indefinably human, something warm and alive that made her feel less alone than she had in months. She thought about the human captain's expression when he'd offered her the jacket. There had been no calculation in his eyes, no hidden agenda or political maneuvering. Just genuine concern for her comfort from someone who barely knew her name. When was the last time anyone had shown her such simple kindness? The question bothered her because she couldn't answer it. Royal protocol surrounded her with layers of ceremony and carefully scripted interactions. Every conversation was a negotiation, every gesture a statement of political position. She had become so accustomed to viewing every interaction through the lens of collective interests that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen as simply herself. Captain Morrison had looked at her and seen someone who was cold. Not a diplomatic asset or a political symbol, just a person who needed a jacket. With a gentle smile that no one else could see, Princess Kylara whispered to the empty room, "Is this a marriage proposal?" She was joking, of course. But, even as she spoke the words, she found herself wondering what it might be like to be courted by someone who offered comfort without expecting anything in return. Someone who could look past titles and treaties to see the person underneath. It was a dangerous thought for someone whose very existence served the delicate balance of interstellar politics. But, as she settled deeper into Jake Morrison's jacket, Princess Kylara decided that perhaps a little danger might be exactly what her life had been missing. The morning briefing in Ambassador Chen's quarters felt more like a war council than a diplomatic meeting. Jake sat across from her at a small conference table, nursing a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been filtered through ship's recycling systems one too many times. Chen had dark circles under her eyes that suggested she'd spent most of the night in emergency communications with Earth. "The situation has become complicated," she began without preamble, activating a privacy screen that would prevent electronic eavesdropping. "I've received word from both the Kethrati and Zephyrian high commands overnight." Jake set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "That doesn't sound good. War Commander Vexthal has formally requested clarification of human intentions regarding Princess Kylara. He wants to know whether your gesture yesterday represents an official diplomatic overture or a personal initiative." Chen pulled up a holographic display showing message headers from multiple sources. More concerning, the Zephyrian Royal Council has demanded an immediate audience with Princess Kylara regarding her inappropriate fraternization with a human representative. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. Fraternization? I gave her a jacket. A jacket that she wore for the remainder of yesterday's sessions and, according to station security feeds, continued wearing during her evening meal and late into the night. Chen's expression was grim. In Zephyrian court culture, publicly displaying such an intimate gift from a potential suitor is tantamount to announcing a formal courtship. Jake rubbed his temples where a headache was beginning to build. How was I supposed to know that? You weren't. But, ignorance of cultural protocols isn't a defense when dealing with interstellar politics. Chen leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Jake, there are forces on both sides who would love nothing more than an excuse to abandon these peace talks. If they can paint Princess Kylara as compromised by human influence, they'll use it to justify walking away from the negotiating table. So what do you need me to do? Apologize publicly? Explain that it was a misunderstanding? Before Chen could answer, her communications console chimed with an incoming priority message. She glanced at the display and her face went pale. It's from Princess Kylara herself. She's requesting a private meeting with you. Jake felt his stomach clench. That's bad, isn't it? That depends entirely on what she wants to discuss. The meeting was arranged for the station's botanical garden, a sprawling section of Haven's Rest where various species had contributed plants from their homeworlds. It was neutral ground in the truest sense, belonging to no one species but maintained by all of them. Jake arrived early and found himself walking among trees and flowers that defied classification, their alien geometries somehow managing to create a sense of peace despite their otherworldly nature. Princess Kylara appeared precisely on time, flanked by her 2 guards but no other members of her delegation. She wore different robes today, still the simple purple she seemed to prefer, but with added insignia that Jake didn't recognize. His jacket was nowhere to be seen, and he found himself surprisingly disappointed by its absence. "Captain Morrison," she said formally as she approached. "Thank you for agreeing to this meeting." "Your Highness." Jake wasn't sure whether he should bow or shake hands or maintain some specific distance, so he settled for standing still and trying to look respectful. "I hope I haven't caused you any trouble." Something flickered across her face, surprise, perhaps, or confusion. "Trouble? No, Captain. You have given me something far more valuable than that." She gestured toward a bench beneath a tree whose bark seemed to shift colors in the artificial light. The guards took positions at a discreet distance, close enough to intervene if needed but far enough away to provide the illusion of privacy. "I need to ask you something," Princess Kylara said once they were seated. "Your gift yesterday, my advisors tell me it represents a human courtship ritual. Is this true?" Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Not exactly. I mean, offering someone your jacket can be romantic, but it doesn't have to be. Sometimes it's just the decent thing to do when someone's cold." "The decent thing," she repeated, and he heard an echo of War Commander Vexthal's puzzled tone from the day before. "This concept appears frequently in human behavior patterns. My analysts have been studying it." "Your analysts?" "The collective maintains extensive cultural databases on all major spacefaring species. We must, in order to maintain our neutrality." She turned on the bench to face him more directly. "What we have never understood about humans is your tendency toward actions that provide no strategic advantage. You expend resources to help strangers. You risk your own safety for beings you have no obligation to protect. Yesterday, you offered comfort to someone you barely knew, with no expectation of reward." Jake considered this. "Doesn't everyone do that?" "No, Captain Morrison. They do not." Her voice carried a weight of experience that made her seem far older than her apparent years. "The Kethrati operate through strict hierarchical obligation. You help those above you in the hope of reward, and those below you only to maintain their loyalty. The Zephyrian way emphasizes collective benefit, individual sacrifice for the good of the whole. But humans." She trailed off, watching a butterfly-like creature with 4 wings and bioluminescent patterns flutter between alien flowers. "Humans help because suffering bothers you," she continued finally. "Not because it serves a purpose, but because you cannot bear to witness pain when you have the power to alleviate it. My analysts find this behavior pattern both fascinating and strategically incomprehensible. Maybe that's because you're looking at it like a strategy instead of just being human." Princess Kylara was quiet for several minutes, and Jake began to worry that he'd somehow offended her. When she spoke again, her voice was so soft he had to strain to hear it. "My entire life has been strategy, Captain Morrison. Every word I speak, every gesture I make, every relationship I form, all of it calculated to serve the collective's interests. I have never known what it might be like to act simply because something feels right rather than because it advances a political goal." The raw honesty in her admission hit Jake like a punch to the chest. He thought about his own life, the freedom to choose his cargo routes, to help stranded travelers, to speak his mind without weighing every word against potential diplomatic consequences. The idea of living completely without such choices seemed like a kind of prison. "That sounds lonely," he said. The butterfly creature landed on Princess Kylara's shoulder, its wings pulsing with soft blue light. She watched it with wonder, as if she'd never seen anything like it before. "I have been alone in the middle of crowds for most of my life," she admitted. "Until yesterday, when a stranger offered me his jacket and made me remember what kindness feels like." Jake felt the conversation shifting into dangerous territory, but he couldn't bring himself to deflect or change the subject. There was something about Princess Kylara's carefully controlled vulnerability that made him want to be honest in return. "Your Highness, I need you to understand something. Whatever my jacket meant in your culture, I wasn't trying to court you or manipulate you or advance some human agenda. I just saw someone who was cold and uncomfortable, and I wanted to help." "I know," she said simply. "That is what makes your gestures so remarkable." She stood from the bench, and the butterfly took flight, its bioluminescent wings carrying it toward the garden's artificial sky. "Captain Morrison, may I ask you something personal?" Sure. What do you want from life? Not for your species or your government or your career, but for yourself as an individual? The question caught him off guard. Most people assumed that cargo haulers led simple lives with simple goals, but Jake had never really articulated his personal ambitions to anyone. I want to keep flying, he said after a moment. I want to see new worlds and meet new people and maybe help out where I can along the way. I want to go to sleep each night knowing I made things a little better rather than a little worse. Princess Kylara nodded as if he'd confirmed something important. You want to live freely and do good where you find the opportunity. Such simple desires, yet so foreign to my existence. What do you want? Jake asked, turning the question back to her. The question seemed to startle her. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. For nearly a full minute, she stood silent among the alien plants, struggling with concepts that appeared entirely new to her. I do not know, she said finally. I have never been permitted to consider my own wants as separate from my duties. But, yesterday, when I put on your jacket, I felt something I had forgotten could exist. What was that? Safety. Not the political safety of neutrality or the physical safety of bodyguards, but the emotional safety of knowing that someone cared about my well-being without requiring anything in return. She looked at him with those deep ocean eyes, and Jake felt something shift in his chest. Is it possible to want more of that feeling, Captain Morrison? Before Jake could answer, his communicator chirped with an emergency signal. He glanced at the display and saw Ambassador Chen's code flashing red. I have to take this, he said apologetically. Captain Morrison, you need to return to the diplomatic quarters immediately. Chen's voice carried an edge of barely controlled panic. The Kethrati delegation is threatening to withdraw from negotiations unless the princess publicly distances herself from human influence. Jake looked at Princess Kylara, who had clearly heard every word through his communicator's speakers. Her face had returned to the diplomatic mask he'd seen during their first meeting, but he could see the disappointment flickering in her eyes. I understand, Ambassador, he said quietly. I'm on my way. As he turned to leave, Princess Kylara caught his arm gently. Captain Morrison. What we discussed here today stays between us, he assured her. That was not what I meant to ask. She hesitated, then spoke with the careful precision of someone choosing words that could reshape the galaxy. If circumstances were different, if I were not a princess and you were not human, do you think we might have been friends? The question hung in the garden's recycled air like a challenge to the natural order of things. Jake looked at this alien woman who had been shaped by responsibilities he could barely imagine, who had never been allowed to want anything for herself, who had been surprised by simple kindness. Your Highness, he said seriously, I think we already are. The emergency session convened 30 minutes later in a conference room that somehow felt smaller than before, despite housing the same number of beings. War Commander Vexthal had brought additional advisors, 2 other Kethrati warriors whose names Jake didn't catch but whose hostile glares needed no translation. Princess Kylara sat alone at her position, her guards stationed by the door like silent sentinels. Ambassador Chen wasted no time with diplomatic niceties. War Commander, we understand you have concerns about the nature of Captain Morrison's interaction with Princess Kylara. Perhaps we could address those concerns directly. Vexthal rose to his full intimidating height, his mandibles clicking with agitation. The concerns extend beyond mere interaction, Ambassador. Intelligence reports indicate that the princess has been seen displaying human artifacts and engaging in private communications with human personnel. The Empire questions whether the collective's neutrality has been compromised by personal attachments. That's ridiculous, Jake said before he could stop himself. Every eye in the room turned to him, and he realized he'd just violated about a dozen diplomatic protocols. I mean, respectfully, War Commander, that's not what happened at all. Then, explain what did happen, human, one of Vexthal's advisors growled. Explain why a cargo hauler was permitted to approach a member of Zephyrian royalty without authorization. Explain why she accepted his offering with the joy typically reserved for treasured gifts. Jake glanced at Princess Kylara, who sat perfectly still with her hands folded in her lap. She gave him the slightest nod, as if granting permission to speak. I offered her my jacket because she was cold, he said simply. That's all. No hidden agenda, no political maneuvering. Where I come from, you don't let people suffer when you can help them. The Kethrati advisors exchanged rapid clicks and whistles in their own language. Vexthal silenced them with a gesture before addressing Jake directly. Human, your species has a reputation for using emotional manipulation to achieve strategic objectives. How can we be certain that your gesture was not calculated to influence the princess's negotiating position? Because if I was trying to manipulate her, I'd have brought something a lot more impressive than a second-hand flight jacket, Jake replied. I'd have brought flowers or jewelry or whatever passes for romantic gifts in Zephyrian culture. I'd have done research and planned an approach and tried to make myself look good. Instead, I saw someone who was uncomfortable and reacted without thinking. Without thinking, Vexthal repeated, his tone suggesting this was somehow even more suspicious than deliberate manipulation. Princess Kylara spoke for the first time since the session began. War Commander, with respect, your concerns about human influence assume that I am incapable of maintaining my own judgment in the presence of kindness. Do you consider me so weak? The challenge in her voice was subtle but unmistakable. Questioning a royal's competence was dangerous territory, even for someone of Vexthal's rank. Your capabilities are not in question, Princess, he said carefully. But even the strongest individuals can be swayed by unexpected emotional stimuli. The Empire has seen too many conflicts escalate due to personal relationships between diplomatic personnel. Then, perhaps, Princess Kylara said with steel beneath silk, the Empire should examine why kindness seems so foreign to its representatives that they interpret basic human decency as manipulation. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Jake realized that Princess Kylara had just delivered what amounted to a diplomatic slap across Vexthal's face, and he wasn't sure whether to admire her courage or fear for her safety. Vexthal's forearms spread in what Jake now recognized as barely controlled aggression. Princess, your words suggest that human influence has already begun to affect your judgment. Perhaps it would be best if these negotiations were postponed until the collective can send a more objective representative. You want me removed from the negotiations, Princess Kylara said flatly. I want assurance that the collective's neutrality remains intact. Ambassador Chen jumped in before the situation could deteriorate further. War Commander, surely we can find a solution that addresses your concerns without disrupting the progress we've made. Perhaps Captain Morrison could return to his ship for the remainder of the talks. Jake felt every eye in the room focus on him again. Princess Kylara's face remained composed, but he thought he saw something fragile break behind her ocean blue eyes. That might be for the best, he said quietly. No, Princess Kylara said, and the word carried such authority that even Vexthal's mandibles went still. Captain Morrison will remain. Princess Chen began. The collective's neutrality is not threatened by Captain Morrison's presence, Kylara continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. It is demonstrated by it. We treat all beings with equal courtesy, whether they are warriors or diplomats or cargo haulers. To dismiss him now would be to show favoritism toward those who demand special consideration. She stood from her chair with fluid grace, and Jake was reminded that beneath her diplomatic training lay the bearing of someone born to command. War Commander Vexthal, you question my objectivity because a human showed me kindness. But I question yours because you cannot recognize kindness when you see it. Perhaps the difference in perspective explains why this war has lasted 20 years. The silence that followed her words was absolute. Jake could hear his own heartbeat in the sudden quiet. Then, impossibly, War Commander Vexthal began to laugh, a sound like grinding stones that somehow managed to convey genuine amusement. You have fire in you, Princess, he said when his laughter subsided. Very well. The human may stay. But I will be watching both of you very carefully. As the session broke up and the various delegations filed out, Jake found himself alone with Princess Kylara for a brief moment. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For standing up for me. For taking that risk. Princess Kylara smiled, the same transformation of her face he'd witnessed the day before, but somehow even more radiant. Captain Morrison, I have spent my entire life avoiding risks in service to my people's safety. Perhaps it is time I learned that some risks are worth taking. As she walked away, Jake realized that somewhere in the space of 2 days, the galaxy had become a much more complicated place. But, looking at the dignified set of Princess Kylara's shoulders and, remembering the smile that had lit up her face, he found himself thinking that complicated didn't necessarily mean bad. The question was whether the rest of the galaxy would see it the same way. 3 days had passed since the confrontation with War Commander Vexthal, and the negotiations had settled into a tense rhythm. Each session began with formal proposals and counter-proposals, gradually evolved into heated debates about territorial rights and resource allocation, and inevitably devolved into barely civilized arguments about past grievances. Jake had taken to sitting in a corner where he could observe without drawing attention to himself, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his presence had fundamentally altered the dynamic of the talks. Princess Kylara had returned to her diplomatic reserve, speaking only when directly addressed and choosing her words with surgical precision. But Jake caught her glancing in his direction when she thought no one was looking, and he noticed that she'd begun wearing a small blue crystal pendant that hadn't been there during the first day's sessions. It was a tiny detail that probably meant nothing, but it made him think of his leather jacket and wonder what small gestures of independence meant to someone whose entire life was choreographed by protocol. Ambassador Chen had grown increasingly nervous as messages from Earth demanded daily progress reports. The diplomatic corps wanted concrete agreements on mining rights, trade routes, and territorial boundaries. What they were getting instead were endless debates about the philosophical differences between human expansion and Kethrati conquest, punctuated by Princess Kylara's occasionally pointed observations about the costs of war. It was during the afternoon session of the 4th day that everything changed. They were deep in a discussion about shipping lane access through the disputed Tau Cygni system when Jake's personal communicator began chiming with an emergency signal. He glanced at the display and felt his blood turn to ice. The call was coming from his ship's automated distress beacon. "Excuse me," he said, rising from his chair. "I need to step out for a moment." Ambassador Chen shot him a warning glance. Interrupting diplomatic proceedings to take personal calls was another protocol violation, but Jake was already moving toward the exit. The distress signal meant either his ship was in immediate danger or someone aboard it needed emergency assistance. Either way, it wasn't something that could wait for diplomatic convenience. He made it 3 steps toward the door before War Commander Vexthal's voice boomed across the conference room. "Stop." Jake turned back to find every being in the room staring at him. Vexthal had risen to his full height, his forearms spread wide in a gesture that looked decidedly threatening. "War Commander," Ambassador Chen said carefully, "Captain Morrison has received what appears to be an emergency signal from his vessel." "Surely, how convenient," Vexthal interrupted, his mandibles clicking rapidly. "An emergency signal that arrives just as we approach consensus on the Tau Cygni shipping lanes. Tell me, human, what manner of emergency requires your immediate attention?" Jake looked at his communicator display, where the distress signal continued to flash red. Ship systems indicated a hull breach in Cargo Bay 3 and life support failure in the crew quarters. Either his ship was being attacked or it had suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure. "Hull breach and life support failure," he said tersely. "I need to get back to my ship." "Fascinating. And who else is aboard your vessel to have triggered such a convenient distress call?" The implication hit Jake like a physical blow. "You think I'm faking this?" "I think human technology is sufficiently advanced to simulate emergency conditions when political advantage is desired," Vexthal replied coldly. "I also think the timing of this emergency is remarkably suspicious." Princess Kylara spoke up from her position at the conference table. "War Commander, surely Captain Morrison's ship is monitored by station security. The authenticity of any distress signal could be verified through independent sensors." "An excellent suggestion, Princess." Vexthal activated his own communicator and spoke rapidly in the clicking language of his people. After a moment, he looked up with an expression of grim satisfaction. "Station security reports no unusual activity around the human vessel. No hull breaches, no life support failures, no evidence of any emergency whatsoever." The accusation hung in the recycled air like a toxic cloud. Jake stared at his communicator display, where the distress signal continued to pulse urgently. Either his ship's sensors were malfunctioning badly enough to report emergencies that didn't exist, or someone had found a way to hack his systems and feed him false data. This doesn't make sense, he said, showing the display to Ambassador Chen. My sensors are showing critical failures across multiple systems. Chen examined the readout with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Jake, could your ship's systems have been compromised somehow? Hacked or sabotaged? Not without direct access to my command interfaces, Jake replied. And those require physical presence aboard the ship plus my personal authorization codes. War Commander Vexthal's mandibles clicked in what was unmistakably satisfaction. How interesting. So either your ship's technology is so primitive that it reports imaginary emergencies, or you are deliberately attempting to disrupt these negotiations with manufactured crises. Neither, Jake said firmly. If my sensors are showing emergency conditions that station security can't verify, then someone with significant technical capabilities is feeding false data into my systems. The question is who and why. Princess Kylara had been studying her own communicator while the others argued. Now she looked up with an expression of dawning understanding. War Commander, she said carefully, I am receiving reports of unusual electromagnetic emissions from the human vessel. Emissions consistent with attempted remote system intrusion. Vexthal's four eyes narrowed. You suggest the human ship is being attacked? I suggest someone wants us to believe Captain Morrison is manufacturing emergencies, Princess Kylara replied. The question is why someone would go to such elaborate lengths to discredit him. Jake felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to fall into place. Because my presence here has become a problem for someone. Because whatever's happening between the princess and me is threatening to someone's agenda. What is happening between you and the princess? Vexthal demanded. The question forced Jake to confront something he'd been trying not to think about for days. His interactions with Princess Kylara had started with simple kindness, but they'd evolved into something more complex. He found himself looking forward to her contributions during negotiations, admiring the way she navigated between competing interests while maintaining her principles. He began to notice small details, the way she tilted her head when considering a difficult point, the subtle steel beneath her diplomatic courtesy, the rare moments when her careful composure slipped to reveal genuine emotion. Nothing inappropriate, he said finally. But I care about what happens to her, and she knows it. Princess Kylara's ocean blue eyes widened slightly at his admission. Captain Morrison. And that bothers someone enough that they're willing to hack my ship's computers to make me look like a liar or a saboteur, Jake continued. The question is who has both the technical capability and the political motivation to pull off something like this. War Commander Vexthal was quiet for a long moment, his mandibles moving in patterns Jake had learned to associate with deep thought. The Empire has certain, hardline factions that oppose any negotiated settlement with humanity. They believe the Kethrati should settle territorial disputes through force rather than discussion. And the collective has similar voices, Princess Kylara added reluctantly. Members of the Royal Council who believe our neutrality has kept us weak instead of safe. They would prefer to ally with the Empire against human expansion. Ambassador Chen looked like she'd swallowed something unpleasant. And Earth has plenty of people who think these talks are a waste of time. Military contractors who profit from conflict, politicians who think we should just take what we want and deal with the consequences later. Jake felt the weight of conspiracy settling around him like a suffocating blanket. So someone from any of our peoples could have decided that disrupting these negotiations serves their interests. And they've decided that the best way to do that is to discredit me specifically. But why you? Ambassador Chen asked. No offense, Jake, but you're a cargo hauler, not a diplomat. What threat could you possibly pose to interstellar politics? Princess Kylara answered before Jake could speak. He poses the threat of demonstrating that our peoples can coexist peacefully. That humans are capable of kindness without ulterior motives. That the Zephyrian collective can maintain neutrality while still acknowledging individual worth. She looked directly at Jake as she spoke. Captain Morrison represents the possibility that we might find common ground based on mutual respect rather than mutual fear. That's a lot of weight to put on one jacket, Jake said quietly. It is not about the jacket, Princess Kylara replied. It is about what the jacket represented. A human seeing a Zephyrian in discomfort and choosing to help rather than exploit. A gesture of care that expected nothing in return. Such actions threaten those who profit from conflict because they suggest that cooperation is possible. War Commander Vexthal made a sound that might have been agreement. The princess speaks wisdom. There are those on all sides who require enemies to justify their positions. Peace threatens their power. As if summoned by their discussion, Jake's communicator chimed again, not with the emergency signal this time, but with an incoming message. The sender's identification was scrambled, showing only a series of numbers and letters that meant nothing to him. "Don't go to your ship," the message read. "The emergency is real, but not what your sensors show. Someone has planted explosives in your cargo bay. They want you to return alone so they can eliminate you quietly. The signal you're receiving is designed to draw you into a trap." Jake stared at the message, his mind racing through implications. If the anonymous warning was true, then someone had escalated far beyond computer hacking. They were willing to commit murder to remove him from the negotiations. He showed the message to the others without comment. The effect was immediate and electric. "This changes everything," Ambassador Chen said grimly. "If someone is willing to kill to stop these talks, then we must consider who benefits from Captain Morrison's death," Princess Kylara finished. "And why his removal serves their agenda." War Commander Vexthal activated his own communicator and began speaking rapidly in his native language. After several minutes of conversation, he turned back to the group with an expression that somehow managed to convey both respect and concern. "I have ordered a full security sweep of the human vessel," he announced. "If explosives have been planted, my technicians will locate and disable them." "Why?" Jake asked. "Why would you help protect me when an hour ago you were accusing me of sabotage?" The Kethrati warrior considered the question carefully. "Because, human, you have shown qualities that are unexpected in your species. You offer aid without seeking advantage. You speak truth even when it serves no strategic purpose. You place the well-being of others above your own comfort." His mandibles clicked slowly. These are not the actions of someone who would manufacture crises for political gain. More than that, Princess Kylara added, your presence has forced all of us to examine our assumptions about each other's peoples. The Kethrati see human kindness and question whether all humans are expansionist aggressors. Humans see Zephyrian neutrality and question whether it represents weakness or wisdom. The collective sees Kethrati honor and questions whether their warrior culture precludes diplomatic solutions. Ambassador Chen nodded slowly. And someone doesn't want those questions to be answered. Someone prefers the status quo of mutual suspicion and occasional war. Jake felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking together. So they try to discredit me first with fake emergencies, and, when that fails, they escalate to attempted murder. Remove the human who's causing inconvenient questions, make it look like an accident, and let the negotiations collapse in recrimination. A logical strategy, Vexthal agreed. But one that requires us to prevent it from succeeding. Over the next several hours, station security and Kethrati technicians conducted a methodical search of Jake's ship. What they found confirmed their worst fears: sophisticated explosive devices planted throughout the cargo bay, rigged to detonate if Jake entered the ship alone. The bombs were of human manufacture, but placed with Kethrati precision and triggered by Zephyrian electronic systems, a deliberate attempt to implicate all three species in Jake's potential death. Professional work, the head of station security reported to the emergency session that convened as news of the discovery spread. Whoever planned this has extensive knowledge of all three species' technologies and access to restricted materials from multiple sources. Princess Kylara spoke into the stunned silence that followed. This conspiracy crosses species lines. We are not dealing with hardliners from any single people, but with a coordinated effort involving individuals from all our governments. The question, Ambassador Chen said slowly, is how far the conspiracy reaches. How many people know about the plan to eliminate Jake? How many are actively supporting it? How many are simply looking the other way? War Commander Vexthal had been unusually quiet during the security briefing, but now he rose to his full imposing height. There is one way to answer those questions, he said grimly. We announce Captain Morrison's death. The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge to sanity itself. Jake felt his heart rate spike as the implications sank in. "You want to fake my death?" he asked. "I want to see who celebrates," Vexthal replied. "I want to observe which individuals across our three governments react to the news with satisfaction rather than regret. I want to identify everyone involved in this conspiracy so we can eliminate the threat completely." Princess Kylara leaned forward, her ocean eyes intense. "It would be dangerous. If the wrong people discover the deception, then Captain Morrison's life will be in even greater peril than it already is," Vexthal finished. "But if we do nothing, these negotiations will collapse, the war will resume, and thousands will die while the conspirators profit from the conflict." Jake thought about his simple life as a cargo hauler, about the uncomplicated satisfaction of delivering supplies to frontier colonies. That life seemed impossibly distant now, separated from his current reality by a chasm of political intrigue and assassination attempts. "What would faking my death accomplish?" he asked. "It would remove the immediate threat to your safety," Ambassador Chen replied. "More importantly, it would allow us to continue these negotiations without the disruption the conspirators are trying to create. And it would force our enemies to reveal themselves," Princess Kylara added. "Whoever celebrates Captain Morrison's death will be marking themselves as part of the conspiracy." Jake looked around the room at these alien beings who had become unlikely allies in the span of a few days. War Commander Vexthal, whose people had been humanity's enemies for 2 decades but who was now offering to risk his own position to protect a human cargo hauler. Ambassador Chen, whose diplomatic career could be destroyed if this gambit failed. Princess Kylara, whose neutrality and, possibly her life were threatened by their growing connection. "If we do this," he said slowly, "and it goes wrong, all of you are going down with me." Princess Kylara smiled, the same transformation that had captivated him days earlier, but, somehow stronger now, touched with steel and determination. "Captain Morrison, some risks are worth taking." As the planning session stretched into the station's night cycle, Jake realized that his simple gesture of offering a jacket to a cold alien princess had somehow escalated into a conspiracy that threatened the balance of power across 3 star systems. The question was whether kindness and courage would be enough to outmaneuver enemies who were willing to kill to preserve the profits of war. Looking at Princess Kylara as she worked with Kethrati warriors and human diplomats to plan his fictional death, Jake found himself thinking that he was about to find out whether humanity's greatest strength really was their stubborn refusal to let others face their battles alone. The irony wasn't lost on him that the biggest battle of his life had started because he couldn't stand to watch someone shiver. The explosion that supposedly killed Captain Jake Morrison lit up the docking ring of Haven's Rest like a miniature star. From his hidden position in an unused cargo bay 3 levels below the blast, Jake watched the feeds from station security cameras as emergency crews rushed toward the twisted wreckage of what had once been his ship. The sight of his life's work reduced to expanding gases and twisted metal hit him harder than he'd expected, even though he'd known it was coming. The charges were placed perfectly, War Commander Vexthal observed, studying the same feeds through his tactical display. "Whoever planned this wanted to ensure no trace of your body could be recovered for analysis." Jake rubbed his eyes, which were stinging from more than just the recycled air in their makeshift command center. "That was my father's ship. He flew it for 30 years before passing it to me." "I am sorry," Princess Kylara said quietly. She'd removed her ceremonial robes and wore simple station coveralls that somehow made her look more approachable than any amount of royal regalia. "I know what it means to sacrifice something precious for a greater purpose." Through the communication feeds, they could hear the official announcements beginning to spread throughout the station and beyond. Captain Jake Morrison, human cargo hauler and diplomatic observer, had been killed in what appeared to be a catastrophic engine failure aboard his vessel. Preliminary investigation suggested a cascade failure in the ship's antimatter containment system, a tragic accident that could have happened to any aging cargo hauler pushing his equipment beyond safe parameters. The story was perfectly plausible, technically sound, and complete fiction. The real explosives had been carefully replaced with devices designed to create the right visual effects while leaving forensic evidence consistent with engine failure. Jake's supposed remains were synthetic materials that would fool all but the most sophisticated analysis, should anyone be suspicious enough to conduct one. "First responses are coming in," Ambassador Chen reported from her position at the communications console. Earth Diplomatic Command is expressing regret at the loss of life and requesting a full investigation. The Kethrati military liaison is offering condolences and assistance with salvage operations. Standard diplomatic responses, Vexthal rumbled. What of the collective? Princess Kylara checked her own secure channels, her expression growing troubled. The Royal Council sends formal sympathies, but I'm receiving private communication suggesting that Captain Morrison's death removes a destabilizing influence from the negotiations. Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cargo bay's environmental systems. Destabilizing influence? Is that what I've become? To those who profit from conflict, yes, Kylara replied. Your presence forced all three sides to question their assumptions about each other. Some people preferred those questions remain unasked. Over the following hours, as news of Jake's death spread throughout the three governments, a pattern began to emerge that confirmed their worst suspicions. Certain factions within each species hierarchy responded to the news with barely concealed satisfaction, while others expressed genuine grief or concern about the implications for the negotiations. On Earth, Admiral Harrison of the Colonial Defense Force issued a statement calling Jake's death a tragic reminder of the dangers faced by civilians in disputed space while simultaneously requesting authorization to increase military patrols in the Tau Cygni system. Senator Williams of the Expansion Committee suggested that the peace talks be suspended out of respect for the deceased, then immediately filed a motion to authorize new human settlements in previously disputed territories. Within the Kethrati Empire, General Kleckstar of the 3rd Battle Fleet sent formal condolences to the human delegation while ordering his forces to enhanced readiness along the border systems. Intelligence reports suggested that several hardline members of the War Council had celebrated privately upon hearing of Jake's death, viewing it as an opportunity to abandon negotiations in favor of renewed military action. Most disturbing of all were the responses from within the Zephyrian collective itself. 3 members of the Royal Council had already requested Princess Kylara's immediate recall, citing concerns about her emotional compromise following the human's death. Others had suggested that the tragedy proved the futility of attempting to mediate between inherently incompatible species. It's worse than we thought, Ambassador Chen said during their second day of monitoring responses. This isn't just a few hardliners from each side working together. It's a coordinated effort involving significant portions of all 3 governments. War Commander Vexthal studied the intelligence reports with the focused intensity of a predator tracking dangerous prey. The pattern suggests a conspiracy that transcends traditional political boundaries. These individuals have more in common with each other than with their own peoples. They share an interest in perpetual conflict, Princess Kylara observed. Military contractors, ambitious generals, politicians who build careers on external threats, they all benefit from keeping our peoples at war. Jake found himself thinking about the simplicity of his old life, when his biggest concern was whether a shipment of medical supplies would reach a frontier colony on schedule. So what's our next move? We've identified the conspiracy, but proving it exists is something else entirely. We continue the charade for now, Chen decided. Let them think they've won. Meanwhile, we gather evidence of their coordination and wait for them to make a mistake. And the negotiations? Princess Kylara asked. Must continue without Captain Morrison's stabilizing presence, Vexthal replied with what might have been dark humor. It will be interesting to see how quickly they devolve into hostility without him there to remind us of our better natures. The prediction proved depressingly accurate. The next session of peace talks, convened the day after Jake's supposed death, began with formal expressions of sympathy and quickly deteriorated into the kind of barely civilized hostility that had characterized human-Kethrati relations for 2 decades. Without Jake's unconscious influence moderating the tone, old grievances and suspicions reasserted themselves with stunning speed. Ambassador Chen found herself defending human expansion policies with increasing desperation. War Commander Vexthal reverted to the aggressive posturing that had marked their early interactions. Princess Kylara maintained her diplomatic neutrality, but Jake could see the strain in her carefully controlled expressions as she watched the careful progress of recent days unraveling in real time. Perhaps, she suggested during a brief recess, the tragic loss of Captain Morrison reminds us of the personal cost of continued conflict. Surely we can honor his memory by redoubling our efforts toward peace. The suggestion fell flat. Without Jake's living example of human decency to contradict their preconceptions, Both sides seemed eager to retreat to the safety of familiar antagonism. The Kethrati delegation questioned human sincerity in seeking peaceful solutions. The human representatives doubted whether the Empire could be trusted to honor any agreement they might reach. From his hidden observation post, Jake watched the negotiations collapse with growing frustration. "This is pointless," he said during their evening briefing. "Without me there to complicate their neat little categories, they're just falling back into the same patterns that started this war in the first place." "Which proves how important your influence was," Princess Kylara replied. "And how threatened the conspirators felt by what you represented. But it doesn't get us any closer to exposing them or saving these talks," Jake pointed out. "At this rate, we'll have formal declarations of renewed hostilities within a week." War Commander Vexthal had been studying communication intercepts throughout their discussion, his mandibles clicking in patterns Jake had learned to associate with dangerous thinking. "There may be another option," he said slowly. "One that requires considerable risk but offers the possibility of ending this conspiracy permanently." "What kind of option?" Chen asked warily. "We arrange for Captain Morrison to return from the dead." The suggestion hung in the recycled air like a challenge to the laws of physics themselves. Jake felt his heart rate spike as he considered the implications. "That's impossible," he said. "Half the station saw my ship explode. There are forensic reports confirming my death. You can't just announce that it was all a mistake." "No," Vexthal agreed. "But we can reveal that it was all a deception. We can expose the entire conspiracy by demonstrating that they were willing to commit murder to prevent peace." Princess Kylara leaned forward, her ocean eyes intense. "You're suggesting we use Captain Morrison's resurrection as a weapon against the conspirators?" "I'm suggesting we force them to reveal themselves completely," the Kethrati warrior replied. "When Captain Morrison returns from the dead, those who celebrated his death will panic. They'll move to eliminate the threat he represents more permanently, and, in doing so, they'll expose the full scope of their conspiracy." Ambassador Chen looked like she was about to object, then stopped herself. "It might work," she said reluctantly. "The shock of Jake's return could force the conspirators into making mistakes they've avoided so far. It could also get me killed for real this time," Jake pointed out. "If they were willing to blow up my ship when they thought I was just a minor inconvenience, what do you think they'll do when they realize I'm actively working against them?" "They'll do what desperate criminals always do," Princess Kylara said softly. "They'll overreach. They'll take risks and make alliances that expose them to discovery. They'll become so focused on eliminating the immediate threat that they'll forget to protect themselves from the consequences." Jake thought about the political forces arrayed against them: military leaders, wealthy contractors, ambitious politicians from 3 different species, all united by their shared interest in perpetual conflict. The idea of deliberately provoking such enemies into direct action seemed like suicide with extra steps. But he also thought about Princess Kylara's words from their first private conversation: "Some risks are worth taking." He thought about the thousands of beings who would die if the war resumed, the colonies that would be destroyed, the families that would be torn apart by a conflict that served no one except those who profited from it. "What would my resurrection look like?" he asked. "A formal announcement that you survived the explosion but were critically injured," Chen replied, already working through the details. "You've been in medical stasis while station doctors fought to save your life. Your recovery is miraculous but not impossible. Medical technology has advanced enough to explain almost any survival story. The key," Vexthal added, "is timing the announcement to maximize impact. We wait until the conspirators have committed themselves to actions based on your death, then reveal that their fundamental assumption was wrong." Princess Kylara stood and moved to the observation window overlooking the station's central hub. Ships from dozens of species came and went through the massive docking rings, their crews going about their business in blissful ignorance of the political machinations that could reshape the galaxy. "Captain Morrison," she said without turning around, "if you do this, if you return from the dead to continue fighting for peace, you will become the most hunted individual in known space. Every hardliner faction from every species will want you eliminated. Your life will never be simple again." "It stopped being simple the moment I offered you my jacket," Jake replied. She turned to face him, and the smile that transformed her features was like watching a sunrise over an alien ocean. Is that your way of saying you regret that moment? Jake considered the question seriously. A week ago, he'd been a cargo hauler with simple goals and an uncomplicated life. Now he was supposedly dead, hunted by interstellar conspirators, and planning to fake his own resurrection to prevent a war. By any rational measure, offering his jacket to a cold alien princess had been the single most disruptive decision of his life. No regrets, he said firmly. But I want something in return. What? When this is over, when we've exposed the conspiracy and saved the peace talks and probably gotten ourselves killed in the process, I want to take you to see the sunrise on Kepler 7. It's one of the colonies that's supposed to be abandoned if the war resumes. The sunrise there is like nothing you'll ever see, 3 suns coming up over crystal mountains that sing in the wind. Princess Kylara's smile grew even brighter. Captain Morrison, is that a proposal? It's a promise, Jake replied. Assuming we survive long enough for me to keep it. As they finalized the plans for his return from the dead, Jake found himself thinking that his father would have been proud. The old man had always said that some cargo was worth risking everything to deliver safely. It had taken Jake 30 years to understand that sometimes the most important cargo was hope itself. Now he just had to survive long enough to make the delivery. The announcement went out during the next morning's negotiating session, transmitted simultaneously to all 3 delegations and their respective governments. The reaction was immediate, electric, and exactly what they'd hoped for. Captain Jake Morrison was alive. The medical bay of Haven's Rest had been transformed into an elaborate stage for Jake's resurrection. Monitoring equipment beeped with convincing urgency while synthetic medical readouts showed the gradual recovery of a patient who had technically never been injured. Dr. Yilmaz, the station's chief medical officer and one of the few individuals cleared for their deception, had done an exceptional job creating the illusion of someone emerging from critical condition. Jake lay in the medical bed, connected to various monitoring devices and looking appropriately pale and weak. The past 3 days of hiding in cargo bays and emergency shelters had actually helped with the latter. He genuinely looked like someone who'd been through a traumatic experience. Remember, Ambassador Chen whispered as they waited for the official announcement to go out, you've been unconscious for days. You don't know about the conspiracy, the assassination attempt, or anything else that's happened since your ship exploded. As far as you're concerned, you were injured in an accident and just woke up. Jake nodded weakly, staying in character even though they were alone. The deception had to be perfect from the moment it began. Too many lives depended on convincing everyone, allies and enemies alike, that his survival was genuine. The first delegation to request access was the Kethrati. War Commander Vexthal arrived within minutes of the announcement, accompanied by 2 medical specialists and an expression of what appeared to be genuine concern. For someone who'd helped plan Jake's fake death, he was putting on a remarkably convincing show of relief. Captain Morrison, Vexthal said as he entered the medical bay. The Empire rejoices at news of your survival. We feared the worst when your vessel was destroyed. War Commander, Jake replied, his voice deliberately hoarse and confused. My ship? What happened to my ship? The Kethrati leader's mandibles clicked in what Jake had learned to recognize as barely contained emotion. Catastrophic engine failure, according to preliminary reports. Your vessel was completely destroyed. Station security found traces of your remains in the wreckage, but apparently the medical scanners were confused by unusual radiation signatures from the explosion. Jake let genuine confusion show on his face. It wasn't difficult, given the surreal nature of discussing his own supposed death. I don't remember any engine problems. I was in my quarters, catching up on some reading, and then nothing. Just waking up here. Memory loss is common in cases of severe trauma, Dr. Yilmaz interjected smoothly. The captain's injuries were extensive. We nearly lost him twice during surgery. Princess Kylara arrived as Vexthal was leaving, and Jake had to fight to control his reaction to seeing her again. She wore formal diplomatic robes and the composed expression he'd come to know so well, but he could see the relief in her ocean blue eyes. Captain Morrison, she said formally. The collective extends its gratitude for your survival. Your perspective has been valuable to our negotiations. Your Highness, Jake replied, managing a weak smile. I hope my absence hasn't disrupted the talks too badly. Something flickered across her face, an emotion too quick for him to identify. The discussions have continued, but progress has been limited without your contributions. She stayed longer than the other visitors, asking about his injuries and recovery time with what seemed like genuine concern. When she finally left, she paused at the medical bay door. "Captain Morrison," she said quietly, "I am glad you survived. The galaxy would be diminished by your absence." Her words carried weight beyond their diplomatic courtesy, and Jake found himself hoping that her concern was more than just part of their elaborate performance. The real test came with the human delegation. Ambassador Chen arrived with 2 intelligence officers and expressions that suggested they were taking no chances with security protocols. If anyone was going to see through their deception, it would be someone from Jake's own species. "Jake," Chen said, and he was surprised by the genuine emotion in her voice. "We thought you were dead. The explosion, there wasn't supposed to be anything left to save." "Apparently I'm harder to kill than anyone expected," Jake replied. "Though I have to admit, I don't remember much about what happened." One of the intelligence officers, a thin, sharp-eyed woman whose name tag read Rodriguez, stepped closer to his medical bed. "Captain Morrison, we need to ask you some questions about the events leading up to the explosion. There are some irregularities in the preliminary investigation that require clarification." Jake felt his pulse quicken, but kept his expression neutral. "I'll help however I can, but, like I told the war commander, I don't remember anything after going to my quarters." "Do you recall anyone having access to your ship in the days before the explosion? Any maintenance personnel, station security, other delegation members?" The question was a trap, Jake realized. If he admitted to anyone having access to his ship, it would provide a potential explanation for sabotage. But, if he denied it too completely, it might seem suspicious given the evidence they'd undoubtedly already gathered. "Station maintenance checked my docking clamps on the second day," he said carefully. "Standard procedure for extended stays. Beyond that, I can't think of anyone who would have had reason to board my ship." Rodriguez exchanged glances with her partner. "Captain, are you aware that your ship's destruction occurred at a particularly sensitive moment in the negotiations? Some people might find the timing suspicious."